Hello, everyone. Good evening to those of you here in Asia, and good afternoon to those of you in Europe, and good morning to those of you in the United States. You are patched into the International Studies Association and Korea International Studies Association post APEC webinar, which is going to go over the outcomes of this event here in South Korea, discuss some of the things that were surprises, some of the things that were expected, and maybe let us know a little bit about the path ahead as South Korea, the US, China, Japan, and all the other participants in APEC move forward. In their various bilateral and multilateral agendas. My name is Mason Ritchie. I'm the president of the Korea International Studies Association and a professor of international relations and international security at Hankook University of Foreign Studies here in Seoul, South Korea. My thanks on behalf of KISA to ISA for helping to get this webinar up and running on the technical side of things and on the organizational side of things. My thanks to everyone who has joined this webinar as well, and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to these three experts who we are lucky to have with us today to discuss APEC and its aftermath. And so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce them. First, we have Michelle Lee, who is the correspondent for Korea and Japan for the Washington Post. An experienced journalistic hand who was actually in APEC, or in Gyeongju, excuse me, for the APEC summit. We also, secondly, have Lee Sang-shin, who is a senior research fellow at the Korea Institute for National Unification, a think tank affiliated with the Ministry of Unification here in Korea. And Sang-shin is, among other things, a domestic politics expert here in Korea with an extensive history in polling and surveys. And so he's a close and attentive watcher of the South Korean political scene. And finally, my colleague, Momen Guda, whose wife, Shaima Hanafi, joined us for the pre-APEC webinar that we held. And Momen is, after his wife, our second best researcher on campus, an absolute economic powerhouse in our university. And we're lucky to have him here to provide the economics angle on this APEC meeting. So without further ado, I'm going to try to make this short and punchy. Here in East Asia, it's late, and the panelists were kind enough to join at this late hour. So I'm going to try to be kind to them as well as to everyone listening here and to make this punchy and fast and get us out of here with the right balance of both insight and speed. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and throw out a first question there. And I'm going to throw this out, I think, to Michelle and to Momen. And basically ask, how would you assess the Gyeongju Declaration, the statement that came out of the sort of multilateral consensus? Were there any surprises in terms of what was included? Was there anything not included that was a surprise, perhaps? So maybe we'll start with Michelle. She was down there, so let's get her take on this first.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and having this panel. It's a little late, but I'm sure the discussion will go by in a lively way. Yeah, I was there in Gyeongju. It was very hectic with a lot of presidential and prime ministerial motorcades, lots of traffic congestion, but in the media center there were snacks flowing, so it was wonderful. I think when I read the Gyeongju statement and then compared it to the statement last year, the Machu Picchu statement, it really stood out to me that there was no like open mention of supporting free trade. And that stood out to me, especially having, like reading through last year's where it specifically said that we will continue to work to deliver a free, open, fair, non-discriminatory trade investment environment. This year had very muted language. It said more like, we take note of diverse discussions on the current state and future of global trade and acknowledge the need of for cooperation. And I think it really speaks to this moment where and perhaps as a recognition of how difficult it'll be to restore to an era of just openly acknowledging and appreciating free trade, especially given the way the U.S. has been moving on the tariffs. I mean, we saw all the deals that the Trump administration and President Lee in Korea and Prime Minister Takaichi were dealing with during this trip, hashing out the investment deals. I mean, we're in a completely different era compared to the pre-Trump time. So I think that really stood out to me and was a reflection of the times. And then I think the couple other things that I found were just interesting is that they talked about AI cooperation, especially given how US and China are the biggest players there. And then talking about a joint framework to respond to demographic change, I thought was an interesting addition, just kind of recognizing these socioeconomic factors that so many countries in the region are going through. So those are the couple things that stood out to me.
Excellent. Thank you. Momin, what's your take on that?
I think Michelle have summed up it pretty nicely. I can add perhaps a couple of points regarding the how Korean it is. How the Gyeongju Declaration at the end of the day is really Korean. It has a Korean flavor, in the sense that the main topics are AI, are demographic change, are green transformation. This is all domestic issues here in Korea that's we're always talking about. So I felt when I was reading it, I felt it has this hard Korean flavor, which is not bad, but it's really Korean. So I felt like Korea has curated it more than just pass something for other nations as well. This is one thing. The other thing is that, and it was shocking for me as an economist, what Michelle have mentioned, the idea that we are still talking about free trade now. We are at the year 2025. Countries are still doubting free trade and they're still not sure about this. While we are still talking about AI, we're talking about technology, future AI, and we cannot get around with free trade. And as far as I know from media reports, is that U.S. was doing some pressure on not endorsing free trade at the Guangzhou Declaration. So for me, I felt like we are heading to the space, but we cannot tie our shoes. So I don't know. Maybe this is how it works when you have too many perhaps politicians and not too many economists in the room. I wish there were some more economists at the end of the day. So yeah, it's really interesting, and we have to wait and see what will happen with this at the end of the day.
I want to come back to in some sense both of those points. The WTO, the lack of WTO or the lack of free trade language, and also this sort of sense in which there's a real stamp on the Gyeongju Declaration in terms of a sort of Korean accent to it, as you put it, in terms of covering its interest. That actually goes back a little bit to something that we talked about in the first webinar, pre APEC webinar, where one of the experts that we had on one of the panelists, talked about the way in which these multilateral meetings serve also national interest and domestic political interest as well. So they're not only multilateral meetings that serve as bilateral scaffolding, but they also can include in the agenda things that are important for the politicians locally. And I guess that sort of leads me to something I want to get from Sungshin. Can you maybe, Sungshin, give us a sense of how you think Lee Jae-myung did as the host, and how South Korea did as the host of this year's APEC? Was this largely considered successful, both, for lack of a better term, objectively speaking, but also perhaps your intuition in terms of how the South Korean population perceived this event and the job that Lee Jae-myung did as president in hosting it on behalf of South Korea?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I think the Lee Jae-myung did surprisingly well to handle the APEC meeting. I said surprisingly because we don't have any expectation for Lee Jae-myung being a top diplomat of the country. Lee Jae-myung does have a very long career as a politician. He started his career as a mayor of Seongnan City, and he became the governor of the Gyeonggi province, and he was elected as the assembly member in 2024. So he had 2 years in assembly, and then he was elected as a president. And during that his political career, he never experienced the foreign affairs and the diplomatic mission. So we didn't know how Lee Jae-myung would handle this enormous task. And not only the meeting, Lee Jae-myung had to handle the aftermath of the Korean martial law situation. He had to deal with Donald Trump. He had to deal with the South Korean dilemma between the U.S. and China. And I think on every aspect, Lee Jae-myung surpassed our expectations. And I think that's the overall consensus in South Korea. Even the oppositional party agrees very reluctantly agrees that Lee Jae-myung did very well as a host of the APEC. To tell you the truth, there are many concerns for this APEC. Since the last December, since the Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law in December 3rd, for the next 7 months, South Korea was essentially we have no government. So we had APEC coming in, but nobody was preparing for the APEC. When Lee Jae-myung was elected in last June, we found that the preparation for the APEC was not going very well, and Lee Jae-myung had only 4 months before the APEC. And in a very short period of time, the Lee Jae-myung and his government handled all the obstacles very well. I think the outcome, however, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I think that the Lee Jae-myung government and the Gyeongju Declaration exceed the overall expectation in South Korea.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up, Lee Jae-myung's sort of inexperience with foreign affairs. I've heard that over and over and over again, especially really since August when the Trump-Lee summit took place in Washington, and seemingly he did a relatively creditable job. Some bumps came afterwards in terms of the economic side of the equation. But I think a lot of people were indeed a little bit surprised at seemingly how a rough and tumble domestic politician with a little experience in the foreign affairs portfolio has acquitted himself so far in his diplomacy. Do you think do you think he's going to get a political bump from this positively? Do you think that it's going to be, for lack of a better term, sustainable? I mean, do you think this, will be something that will sort of be sticky in terms of the domestic support that he gets here? And then secondly, do you think that this, that hosting APEC in the apparently, successful way that he did, do you think that this, raises South Korea's stature as a sort of, middle power that's aiming at more of a global leadership role? And do you think that that's something that Lee Jae-myung is interested in doing? Do you think he's interested in taking up this kind of, for lack of a better term, I'm going to be careful here, but the sort of Yoon Suk-yeol global pivotal state kind of approach where, trying to globalize South Korea's role as a middle power a little bit?
Thank you for the question, and those questions are very important ones. First of all, Lee Jae-myung's approval rating. We already have 2 the approval ratings at the public opinion survey reported after the APEC meeting, and they reported that Lee Jae-myung's public approval rating is going up, which is not surprising considering how successful the APEC meeting was. Before pre-APEC, actually the Lee Jae-myung's approval rating was a little bit going down, and mainly because of the housing prices. Housing prices in South Korea is critical matter, especially to the Democratic Party president. Lee Jae-myung's predecessor, Moon Jae-in, and even Roh Moo-hyun, they failed mainly because of the housing prices. They couldn't just regulate the housing prices. And since September, we have indication that the apartment housing prices in Seoul is skyrocketing. And the Lee Jae-myung government had to use the very severe restriction to regulate the housing prices in Seoul, which was not very popular among the Seoul citizens. But thanks to the APEC meeting, Lee Jae-myung and the Democratic Party's approval rating is going up. But usually this kind of the event effect on approval rating doesn't last long. But the good thing is going on for the Lee Jae-myung, which is stock market. Korean stock market is doing amazingly well. Just today, the KOSPI index, the Korean stock market index, recorded historic high. Since Lee Jae-myung's inaugurations, Korean stock market literally get doubled. Before Lee Jae-myung, it was 2,200 point. Now today it's 4,200. So it's almost doubled since Lee Jae-myung's the inauguration, and that is very positive sign for Lee Jae-myung. And in South Korea, we have local elections scheduled in next May. So it is very important for the Lee Jae-myung and Democratic Party to maintain this high approval rating. And I think that still the housing price, the issue is kind of it's always the high housing price it's like a kryptonite for the Democratic Party. If they cannot handle it well, it will ruin Lee Jae-myung and the Democratic Party. I'm very certain. But since the last result of the Lee Jae-myung government of the housing prices, the housing prices is going down. That's a good sign. Also, there are several economic indicators, very positive indicators are being reported. I think that's very positive for the Lee Jae-myung and the Democratic Party and the prospect of the local election. For the second part of your question, how about the South Korean's dream of being the middle power? Every South Korean president has a different naming about their vision for the foreign policy, but they all want the same thing. South Korea wants to be to something. We want to be influential in international politics. I'm not sure if that is the reachable goal, but they all want the same thing, and I'm sure the Lee Jae-myung want the same thing. And interesting enough, we always ask South Korea which choice South Korea would make between the United States and China. Will South Korea choose China? Will South Korea choose United States for its security and economy? But I think maybe we better ask the different questions. Will China pursue South Korea for their benefit? What will the United States do to South Korea? And interesting enough, South Korea is being recognized as a kind of important allies to the United States with our MASCA project and our investment in the United States, and also China is very aggressively pursuing South Korea. After the summit, Xi Jinping and Lee Jae-myung summit, Xi Jinping met Park Jin-young, one of the top leading K-pop producer, and Park Jin-young said that why don't you have big K-pop concert in Beijing? And Xi Jinping said yes, which is very significant because since 2017, at the installation in South Korea, so China is not allowing the South Korean cultural industry to the Chinese market. And Xi Jinping signaled that maybe they are willing to lift the ban of the Korean cultural industry to the Chinese market. If that happens, it will be a very significant progress between China and South Korea. So I think that in some way, because the U.S.-Chinese the strategic competition, maybe to South Koreans the international role can be assessed in different ways. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of different roles South Korea will play especially in Eastern Asia politics.
Thanks. I just came back from Beijing actually, and it's interesting. You see so few Korean cars compared to, obviously Chinese cars, but Japanese cars and even other foreign models. And yeah, the sort of shocking lack of K culture presence there is really kind of fascinating. And if that's something that comes out of it, out of this APEC, I think that would be quite interesting for Korea. Which actually, that's a nice bridge to go back into sort of something you said earlier, and then throw a couple of questions to Michelle and Momen that get to the issue of Korea as globally influential and economically and politically. You brought up K-pop and K-culture. The Gyeongju Declaration, does mention creative industries as a growth driver. That seemed like that was something perhaps a little bit new that came out of the declaration. We're going to get to some of those bilateral issues, which you talked about, Sang-Shin, the U.S.-South Korea relationship and U.S.-China. We'll get to some of those bilateral things. I'm trying to do justice to the multilateral nature of this, not just make it about all the bilateral stuff, which has gotten all the headlines. So I guess I'll throw this question out to Michelle and Momen. Despite the fact that the Gyeongju Declaration doesn't really give a full-throated defense of multilateral open trading architectures, does it in some way still point the global trading system to some more open pathway, even if it's just, for instance, for smaller groupings of states to establish diverse trade mechanisms, maybe regional trade mechanisms, for instance, and some breathing space to get away from the sort of predatory, pressure-filled approaches that we see from U.S. and China? I mean, do we see any sort of hints of some of these middle powers working together to try to construct some alternate trade architectures that might escape the vice grip of Beijing and Washington? Maybe I'll start with Michelle on that one.
Well, Momen is a trade expert, but I guess one thing I will say is that even though the U.S. has very much taken a back seat from these multilateral groupings around trade, other groupings have persisted and actually gotten stronger as a result, like CPTPP. More countries are now trying to join that. RCEP has continued, and I think it's become clear that these countries need to band together to find, if not alternatives, then at least other pathways for increased cooperation, because they see the need for that. And I think, especially having covered Japan, covering Japan now, I see how much Japan wants to play a leadership role in leading some of these smaller regional groupings as a counter to China, especially, and in the U.S. instead. So I think this Gyeongju Declaration and this effort at APEC underscored that, and I thought it was especially symbolic that President Trump didn't stay for the Leaders Summit. It points to exactly what we're talking about, this sort of literal stepping away from these sorts of discussions and putting somebody from his cabinet there instead. And I was looking at even the leader's photo, and you can tell, the U.S. presence is taken a back step in the second row. We're already seeing countries diversify on their own. Like ASEAN is strengthening ties with Brazil and South Africa. We're seeing like South Korea and Vietnam strengthen ties, and I think more of these all the other bilateral relationships and smaller multilateral groupings, we see it in security spaces already in the region, and I think on the trade front, it just makes sense for that to continue.
Fair enough. That's a great set of points. Momen, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, we're continuing on the same path. I mean, there is not no significant change to what we have been witnessing in the last years when it comes to trade and so on. Perhaps there is some breathing air for the small economies here in Asia and so on, of course, middle income economies and so on, because we all love the idea of stability. And what Michelle has mentioned is actually very true. I mean, in this world we're living in, where there's lots of turbulence and lots of instability, and unfortunately, and I'm sorry to say this, stemming mainly from politics of the U.S. and so on, there are so many problems when it comes to economics, because we all want to be able to work, and to invest and so on. We cannot do this without stability. And what Trump, the signals that has been given to us all in the last years, or last year actually, is that there's no stability. It's only deals, and it's only ad hoc words, ad hoc policies, and so on. It's very, very hard to forecast. So maybe there's some stability now. I mean, the declaration doesn't really make new grounds, but at least we are continuing on the same grounds. Still, we have stability, which is okay. But the main issue for me, at least, is that there is no new incentives whatsoever. I mean, incentives is a very, very important word that we like in economics. And when there is no incentives for middle income countries and small countries to do anything, it makes me wonder, then what are we doing? If there is no mechanism, no incentives, nothing on this. So it's not really clear, Again, this is something that we have to wait and see. But for me, it felt like unfortunate event. Overall, it's positive, but I would have loved to have seen more. The positive will come, Mason, when you talk about the bilateral issues. We'll talk about some positive aspects. But for the multilateral, as you have been saying, there is not so much meat at the end of the day. So that's my take.
Well, then I feel like you've kind of already answered the next thing I wanted to get to. So I'll just ask you if you have anything additional to add on this. But do you think that any of the developing economies that are a part of APEC, get anything useful out of this on the multilateral side of things? You've got the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand and some other developing economies who are a part of APEC. Did they get anything out of this? Or as you talked, as you mentioned, as you mentioned in the beginning, Korea sort of put its stamp on this in a way that dealt with aging societies, demographic issue that's a problem in East Asia, but maybe less so of a problem in Indonesia or a place like that. AI, which I guess has a general or universal role to play, but maybe isn't top of mind for the people in Indonesia or Vietnam. Or a place like that. I mean, is there anything that the developing economies got out of this on the multilateral side of things?
I mean, my understanding is that China is becoming now a beacon of stability in the region, a beacon of economic stability, and U.S. is losing this role. I mean, looking back 10 years ago, this was not the case. And now China, I mean, all those economies, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on, they're looking up and they're seeing this deal that happened. 1 year of breathing space for China and U.S., and this makes them happy. There's a relief, at least for 1 year. But you never know. And this is the main problem here. You never know with Trump. We never know what will happen tomorrow morning. That doesn't mean that she is magnificent and doing a great job. Still, it's stable. A rational leader, whether this leader is it's democracy or dictatorship or whatever, it's rational. So I think they are thrilled. I mean, those economies. And I think all over, even in Korea, when it comes to bilateral agreements with, of course, Korea and Japan and Korea and US, I think people are thrilled that at least we have some breathing space for 1 year ahead. We never know what will happen down the road, but at least things are proceeding in the same road. However, China will play more role. China will dominate economically more and more. If US doesn't stop its this kind of, ad hoc strategy, ad hoc economic strategy, maybe political, you can do whatever, but economics, you have to be very, very careful. But because any change matters and counts, and you cannot go back, So yeah, I mean, overall it's positive, but we have again to wait and see what will happen when it comes to Trump, and hopefully things will go on the right path,
Yeah, we had a guest lecturer today on campus, a former senior foreign service officer, who spent a long time in Korea, and this person made an interesting and I think very astute point that so many of the institutions that underpinned the second half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century were founded, or at least co-founded, by the U.S. They were structured by the U.S. They were maintained by the U.S. And now the U.S. is stepping back from them. And Michelle said, you've got Scott Bessent representing the U.S. president, in the second row, and that opens up space for other states. And I guess my interest in these multilaterals is perhaps to see if there's something happening other than the obvious route, which is that China steps in and takes over a larger role, not only because of the size of its economy and its proximity to these states, obviously in the APEC area, but also because something beats nothing, right? 90% of life is showing up, and they're showing up, and Trump left early. Whether or not his presence would have made things better or worse is a different question, I think. But to some degree, the absence of the U.S., I think, is an interesting question for how the multilateral system is supposed to move forward. All that being said, we've spent now a good 25 minutes talking about what's wrong with the multilateral system. So let's switch over to the bilateral stuff. I've got sort of one question to ask there, and then after that, we'll turn it over to any questions that we have from the people participating. So besides the APEC multilateral, these last 5 days have featured a number of bilaterals. We had Xi and Trump, we had Xi and Lee, we had Lee and Trump, we had Takaichi and Lee, we had Takaichi and Xi, as well as some others, some lesser light, so to speak. I'll throw this out to each of you. What are some of your major takeaways from these bilateral meetings? And I'll start with Sangshan, I think.
Yes, in Korea, the shocking news was of course, the nuclear-propelled submarine. I didn't expect that. I didn't expect the U.S. allowed the South Korea to have the nuclear-powered submarine. And today, the presidential office announced that the spokesman said that even China understand why South Korea should have nuclear-powered submarine. That was even more surprising. Why the two world-leading superpower acknowledged the South Korea's region to have nuclear-powered submarine. And obviously, one of the region is North Korea. North Korea, they announced that they have planned to build nuclear submarine. Probably they have the technical support from Russia. So that's why South Korea wants nuclear submarine. But to tell you the truth, South Korea wanted the submarine for as long as I can remember, even in the Kim Il-sung presidency, which was in 1990s. We have the detailed plan under Nomuyon president, I think it was 2004, 21 years ago. 21 years ago, South Korean government has all the detailed plan for the nuclear submarine. They even have, started the developing the techniques for the nuclear. They almost finished the developing of the nuclear power. So all they need was the nuclear fuel. Now the United States agreed to provide South Korea with the uranium, so that there is no difficulties for the South Korea to acquire nuclear submarine. The South Korean government officially said that it will take another 10 years for the South Korea to have nuclear submarine, but I wouldn't be surprised that maybe in 5 years, maybe 3 years, maybe South Korea was already secretly building nuclear submarine. That wouldn't surprise me. What surprised me is China. Why would China to allow South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. People are talking about why the regions why China becomes so generous with this South Korean nuclear submarine. And I could think of the one hypothesis. Maybe China is not so happy with North Korea being too close with Russia, or North Korea is building their own nuclear submarine. China would not be happy with North Korean nuclear submarine in the West Sea. So why not two Korea has two submarines? So it doesn't make any difference for the China. That would be my guess. But we will have to research why China decided to allow South Korea to have another strategic weapon. And also after the first meeting, Lee Jae-myung's meeting with Donald Trump, and in the press conference, Lee Jae-myung talks about the something called 안미경중. That's a Korean phrase meaning U.S. for the Korean security, China for the Korean economy. Korea is dependent on the U.S. for the security, and we are dependent on China for the economy. And Lee Jae-myung said that maybe we have to rethink about that policy. Maybe we have to. We need more strong economic ties with the United States while be more independent from our economic relationship with China. But after the APEC, I began to doubt how serious was Lee Jae-myung when he said that maybe we have to abandon the 안미경중 policy. So I don't think South Korea has given up the old position that we have to be maintained a neutral position between China and United States. China is not going away from South Korea. China will be there. So China will always be influential to the Korean Peninsula. And as Momen said, that there are so many variables, so many unpredictability with the United States and Donald Trump these days. So if these things goes on, then eventually Chinese influence on Korea, both in north and south, will be greater. And that's if I don't know if that is a good thing, but in South Korea, many people are already asking the question, which was unthinkable a few years ago. The question that if South Korea would be better with China, that was unthinkable question among South Korean experts and public. But now we are discussing about it, which is even more shocking to me.
It's interesting. I mean, you're right. I mean, China is going to be there, and as we say, you can in international relations, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your neighbors. Sure, we definitely see how the Trump administration, has, in several cases, pushed together, countries who had been, previously antagonistic to each other. We've seen that with, India and China. So it's kind of interesting if there's going to be an uptick in the way that's happening here on the peninsula. Personally, I think I'm a little less confident than you are in how this sub deal might work. I know indeed, the Korea Atomic Energy Research Agency, KERI Institute, excuse me, has they have reactor designs, or at least some version of them, and I think that they have some plans in drawers. I'm still a little skeptical that the United States is actually going to end up supporting this the way that Trump said it would. The what we call the interagency process in the United States is kind of broken, which means this seemingly came kind of out of nowhere, and the rest of the U.S. government, I think, hasn't put their stamp of approval on this yet. So I'm not quite ready to saddle the horse and ride, but we'll see. Anyway, Michelle, what's your take on some of the bilat stuff that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical on that too, especially with the congressional approval part. I think, revisiting 123 agreement and all that will take some time. For me, I thought that, we talked about Lee Jae-myung's successful diplomatic engagement this time, and I think he and other leaders have really nailed the formula with the Trump visits now. Lots of flattery, lots of golden gifts, and shiny things, whether it's a list of potential investments in the US, like Japan did, or literal foot tall crown, like President Lee Jae-myung did. But I thought that, the summit, beyond all of that, and the nuclear submarine thing, it was a big win for Lee Jae-myung in that and South Korea, and that it resolved the issue over the $350 billion investment fund, at least for now. Some of the details that the two sides were trying to work out, and they weren't sure if they could actually hash it out in time for APEC. They seem to have reached some sort of an understanding that, the 200 billion of it would be in cash, and that 150 would be in shipbuilding, and the 200 billion would be capped at 20 billion per year. I think having those details worked out, even though we still haven't seen it in writing, like with many things with the current US administration, but I think that was a big deal, a big hump to get over, at least on the working level part. And then I thought it was at least in terms of building good relations and building a good vibe around this visit, it was interesting that the issue of defense spending and cost sharing did not come up, at least in a public sense. We were watching to see if that would be a sticking point during the US South Korea bilat, but at least it didn't surface up on the public level. But I think that is still very much looming, the whole issue about modernizing the alliance, what happens to USFK, if it's more China facing than North Korea facing. Those issues are still looming, but it at least didn't bubble up to the surface to a point where we saw it. So I think that sort of helped tamper, whatever tensions may be underlying the bilateral relationship right now. And then, Mason, when you mentioned, other sorts of relationships between different countries getting closer despite previous tensions, I think an example of that is the Japan-South Korea relationship, at least with the two new administrations. This was the first time that Prime Minister Takaichi, who was just elected 2 weeks ago, and then President Lee, who's also new, had a chance to actually interact and have a summit. And they had a summit that was scheduled for about 20 minutes. It went on for 45 minutes. They exchanged a bunch of gifts. Prime Minister Takaichi had said in her first press conference after being elected that she likes K-beauty and Korean Kim seaweed. So President Lee gifted K-beauty products and Kim, which is just like a nice little gesture. But I think what underlies the two countries, this time they talked about how, they acknowledge that historical issues do exist, but they want to build a forward-looking relationship. And I do believe that what underlies that is pragmatism on both sides. Prime Minister Takaichi is very much a nationalist. She has very strong views on historical issues. We know President Lee has led, anti-Fukushima protests when he was head of the National Assembly. But the two leaders have clearly decided that for now, in the short term at least, it helps both countries to work with each other. And I think that is a tacit recognition of the unreliability of the US. The trilateral engagement that has strengthened in the past few years with US, Japan, South Korea, it was the US holding that together for the past couple of years, but now it's up to Japan and South Korea to try to move that forward, especially because the Trump administration has never been quite keen on moving the trilateral relationship forward. So when I saw the two leaders really at least acknowledge publicly they want to pursue this two-track approach, I think that was a very clear sign of the pragmatism that they have chosen to take, and I believe they're going to keep pursuing because it's a necessity now.
That's excellent. Yeah. For years and years, we always talked about how, the United States had to bang heads together in Seoul and Tokyo in order to get them to cooperate. And, it was like herding cats, to mix metaphors. Who would have thought that actually the US stepping back and basically, making themselves seem less reliable would actually have the same effect. It's a sort of weird reverse US double-barreled sunshine policy towards Seoul and Tokyo. Momen, take us home. What's your give us a 1 minute on your take on some of the bilats, and then we'll open up questions for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, we're not going to have much more time than that. I think we're trying to get everybody out of here. But Momen, give us your quick take on the bilats.
Sure. Couple of things. I think for Korea, it's really interesting. The bilateral meetings went really, I mean, better than what I expected, considering Japan, considering China. And what happened in the Cambo chicken actually left many people, really happy and fascinated by and here I'm referring to the meeting by NVIDIA head with the Samsung head with Hyundai head. It's really very, very refreshing. And I think it's very invigorating for Korea. I mean, to see that Korea is heading to the AI and maybe dominating even AI, who knows? But it's very interesting. You know, this is a side note from the bilateral. But the big take for me for the bilateral is that for those of you who don't know about trade negotiations, it's really boring. Huh? So 23 years ago, I was part of the trade negotiations between Egypt and European Free Trade Area. And it's really boring because you have big books of HS codes of items, and you are talking about each item, and it's really like watching paint dry. It's really boring case. Nowadays, with what's happening between Trump and Xi, it feels like a thriller. You know, it feels like you go to a meeting and then, yeah, here is the tariff cut for you, and here is a tariff cut for you, and here is a trade. And for me, it's really weird, you know, because this is really undermining many things that we have learned and many things that we know of the US. You know, there is a huge body called USTR, US Office of Trade Representative. It's very, very important, US. Suddenly, nobody's talking about USTR. You know, USTR was always doing all this heavy lifting with tariffs and NTBs and so on. Now it's one word from Trump or one word, and everything has changed. So for me, it's really puzzling, you know, and these things are not great for me because, again, this is instability. We don't know what will happen in the future. We don't know what will happen tomorrow morning. And it's really bad for forecasting, for business or economics, you know. So, yeah, we have to brace and see what will happen. And hopefully it turns out fine at the end. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Momen. I appreciate it. So I'd say as long as the panelists are okay for it, if we can have 5 minutes of Q&A, have a few questions come in, and I'll basically ask the panelists to do a sort of lightning kind of response. So here we have one question. If South Korea gains a nuclear submarine, would it be a threat to the implementation of the NPT or trigger military buildup in other countries? Michelle, you want to go for that one?
Yeah, well, I think it would definitely at least make Japan interested in pursuing something similar. I mean, there's already a nuclear debate going on in Japan that's not as blatant as the one in South Korea, but I think it would be definitely making Japan interested in pursuing some sort of similar capabilities. On the NPT front, I think there's already a discussion about how this aligns with NPT, and I think we have to wait to see whether like the Korean-US agreement over nuclear actually gets revised in a way that it needs to be. But I think the broader question that we've been asking is, about it contributing to further proliferation, right? The whole reason that the US didn't want to agree to something like this before and set up the whole 123 agreement was that even civilian uses of nuclear energy could be used for a military purpose. And so we're now moving more toward a proliferating country. And then you add on top of that the Trump announcement that US is going to resume nuclear testing. I mean, all signs are pointing to kind of a slippery slope. And I think it could be a kind of messy place if we start heading that route. So,
yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a whole lot, in terms of what we don't know about this nuclear deal that makes it difficult to answer the question about the effect on the NPT. I mean, to be fair, the NPT is already under enormous pressure anyways, and so this certainly doesn't help, I guess, is the short version of the story. It seemed like we have another question that just came in. Hold on. Are there any lessons that EU policymakers can draw from the APEC summit and bilaterals in a context where Europe is trying to diversify its partnerships to reinforce its strategic autonomy and economic resilience? So lessons for other regions, maybe Sungshin, 30 seconds on that, and then Momin, any lessons that a more or less well-functioning multilateral the EU can draw from what's come out of what's come out of APEC?
Europe already have EU. The Asian Pacific countries have APEC because we don't have EU. So that, I don't think that we are asking wrong question. Well, that the question should be why Asian countries do not have the international organization like EU. And if you remember, in early 2000, there was a discussion about the why China, Japan, and South Korea form kind of the EU style, the international cooperation, and United States were very positive about that project, the building economic community in East Asian area, the area, binding China, South Korea, and Japan. And as Max mentioned, interestingly, South Korea and Japan is overcoming our historical dispute, and I think that the two countries will have more cooperation economically and militarily and politically. And I don't know about the China, but if United States is abandoning its role as a stabilizer in East Asian politics, we cannot rule out the possibility of the emerging EU like the political community in East Asia. That's very remote possibility, but I think we have to keep look out for it.
Momin, anything you want to add, or?
I mean, there is no lesson. This is the different ball game totally. You know, different institutions, different context. So perhaps the thing that EU policymakers should be looking, of course, for the role of China. We have to remember, of course, we are always talking about economic cooperation and all this fancy words, but at the end of the day, we have economic competition. You know, this is the essence of the game, you know. So what's good for China is bad for the EU and vice versa, you know. So China is gaining momentum. China is gaining grounds economically in Asia. And I think this makes EU policymakers, especially economists, worried also. So again, I mean, it's not good day for the EU, but again, this is how it's being played, you know.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, you know, part of my question about whether or not there were some sort of smaller groupings of mini lateral groupings, we call them, between some of these middle powers trying to build up an alternative trade architecture, isn't just about getting some pressure, getting some relief from pressure from the U.S., but also from China. And although Europe is not in APEC, obviously, you know, none of the European states is in APEC. You know, Europe obviously finds itself in a very difficult position where, to the extent that China is pushed out in some ways, even if relatively minor, but nonetheless still pushed out of parts of the U.S. market, it's looking for market share in Europe now, and you know they represent a real risk to the market share that Europeans have within Europe. And if you're Germany, I think especially you're worried about that and would like to find, you know, ways that you can also diversify away from China. We have one last question, and I'll just a 30-second answer, really, because other than that, I feel like I will have worn out my welcome with my friends here in this panel. It says, as Dr. Lee said, Korea wants to be an influential in the international stage, moving on from talking about North Korea and simply reaffirming U.S. support. But there are many obstacles to this, and I would like to ask if the conservative nature of MOFA, coupled with the lack of experience by President Lee, can be overcome in order to help Korea take on a bigger role on the international stage. So can an inexperienced with foreign affairs President Lee and a small C conservative MOFA can they push the ball forward on South Korea becoming a more influential global player? You have 30 seconds.
Girl. I think it's important that he has Lee Sung-lak as National Security Advisor and Ambassador Cho Hyun as Foreign Minister. They are very experienced foreign policy hands and have a very clear vision of South Korea in the world stage. And I think part of what we saw with the success of Lee Jae-myung this time was thanks to them. And I think we can't discount the role that they could have in sort of playing out these dynamics that the questioner is talking about.
Excellent. Sung-shin?
Yeah, there are two factions in Korean, the Democratic Party, the foreign policy factions. Let's call them one nationalist faction and international faction. And nationalist faction has some complaint about the internationalist, the being the Jo Hyun or Lee Sung-lak. They said that by demanding denuclearization of North Korea, the nationalist factions argued that international faction is the limiting South Korean capability to improve our relationship in North Korea. I'm not sure if that is true. If that is true, there are the two factions competing in the foreign policy, the community in South Korea, but there exists, there are some complaint among the South Korean, the left wings, that the conservative MOFA and their factions, their tendency to depend on the United States is the hindering South Korea's capability to do more our role in East Asia. But personally, I think that's too far strategy.
Fair enough. All right, with that, I'm going to have to gavel us down and bring us to a close. On behalf of the Korea International Studies Association, and I want to thank Professor Moman Guda, Michelle Lee, and Dr. Lee Sung-shin from KINU for joining us today as panelists at this late hour. Thanks, obviously, to all of you who joined as participants. Thank you for your attention and for your questions. And then also my thanks to Team ISA, including Sarah Dorr, Hannah Lee with tech support, and Kat Folker, who helped in the background to get everything set up. I really appreciate it, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening, wonderful afternoon, and wonderful day, depending on where you are. And I hope that we will cross paths again in one way or another. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.